by Mike Lindell. From Crack Addict to CEO. Continued at Chapter 25. The Feds. Go back. There was more discussion and several more items of business. When the meeting concluded, everyone filed out, except for Colby, Bates, my brother, Corey, and me. Colby looked across the table at me and said, "Mike, we're moving the company to Inver Grove Heights. Also, you and Karen are fired." Chapter 25, The Feds. You read that right. I was fired from my own company. I was shocked, as was Corey. You could argue that when Neff tried to hijack the Schmitty's contract, I should have seen it coming. After all, my bookie's nephew had warned me. But now two respected businessmen had taken over my pillow within weeks of engineering a majority on a board they had urged me to create. Looking back, I realized that their initial buy-in of 38% may not have been a random number. Instead, it seemed calculated, high enough for me to raise a lot of capital, while low enough to seem non-threatening. And it was Colby and Bates who urged that the corporate rules require a 60% shareholder majority to kick someone off the board. From the beginning, all they needed was another 3% of stock to drive me out. Maybe they even had that 3% lined up from the start. In business, a great product is much rarer than money. I've since learned that entrepreneurs without money have their products stolen or copied all the time. After this and my experience with Barry Price, I was beginning to think I couldn't trust a guy in a suit. What happened next only reinforced that opinion. It had been more than 3 years since I declared a shady bankruptcy to avoid that shady dram shop lawsuit. Since then, a team of lawyers had been looking into my finances. Now, we finally had a court date. In January 2007, Karen and I appeared before a bankruptcy judge in a courtroom in the Minneapolis U.S. District Court, an imposing tower of beige and glass. In addition to the lawyers sitting at tables normally reserved for the prosecution and defense, there were a few spectators in the gallery. Two of them seemed a bit out of place. They had closely clipped haircuts and wore jackets and ties. Great, I thought. More suits. "All rise," a bailiff said, then announced the arrival of the judge, who took his place at the raised bench. "Be seated," the judge said. I had gotten us into one heck of a mess, and it was all on the line right here. I'd lost more than $50,000 card counting in Vegas. I still owed Wayne $84,000 for the patent. I owed my friend Bob over $100,000 more money I'd borrowed against the Schmitty's contract in order to develop the My Pillow, develop the pillow and build the company from which I'd just been fired. If the judge clawed back the Schmitty's contract, the lawyers would sell it, pull the assets back into the bankruptcy, and we'd be left with nothing. Prior to our hearing, I had cut a deal with the court. With money borrowed from my dad and more I borrowed from Bob, I handed the court $105,000 to pay off the bankruptcy. I projected that I would get at least half of this back. The judge read our case aloud, then rendered his verdict. My Chapter 7 bankruptcy was granted, but there was a catch. The entire $105,000 I had already paid was to be used for attorney's fees. My temper erupted. "Objection!" I yelled at the judge. "This is wrong. They doubled their fees at the last minute." When I made the deal with the court attorneys, fees were only $50,000. This was crooked, and I knew it. But I also knew I'd gotten myself into this mess by declaring a fake bankruptcy. Now it was as though I'd been caught bringing illegal dice to an illegal dice game. I had put myself completely at the mercy of a crooked system. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Lindell, you are out of order. He also confirmed that the lawyer's fee was allowable. I pointed at the judge sitting up high on his bench. Are you in on it too? I shouted. He banged his gavel again. Do you want to go to jail, Mr. Lindell? Then I suffered a complete meltdown and started calling the lawyers in the courtroom every name in the book. This is it, I thought. End of the line before my bankruptcy. I wasn't bankrupt, but now, ironically, I was. Furious with the judge, the lawyers, and with myself, I turned to leave the courtroom and Karen followed. I fully expected to be arrested on a contempt charge before I even made it out of the room. Sure enough, as we neared the courtroom door, the two suits had been sitting at the back of the gallery intercepted us in the aisle and grabbed me by the elbows. Mr. Lindell, one of them said, FBI. FBI? Are you kidding me? It was just a little fake bankruptcy. Why would the FBI be here? The two feds hustled us out of the courtroom. As we walked down a tiled corridor, one of them said, Your bankruptcy has been under investigation for the last 3 years. We've been waiting for the conclusion of your case. The agents told us that these particular bankruptcy attorneys had a history of pooling the assets in bankruptcies, then matching their attorney's fees to the value of the assets. When the case is concluded, the only ones getting any money were the lawyers. Apparently, though, the judge I'd just accused of corruption wasn't in on it. Karen and I continued toward the elevators with the two agents. Would you like to be a witness for us if you are needed? One of them asked. Absolutely, I said. But right now, I think I'm about to go to jail for what I said to the judge back there. Don't worry, the agent said. We'll get you out of here. The four of us took the elevator down to the lobby where several uninformed officers blocked our way. The FBI agents flashed their badges. They're with us. 1 second, I was about to go to jail in a fake bankruptcy case for cursing out a judge. The next, officers of the law parted like the Red Sea, and I walked out the door a free man, courtesy of the FBI. What are the odds? I may have been free, but I hadn't gotten off cheap. The money that I owed my dad and Bob still hung over my head, along with everything else. The FBI asked to see my financial records. Very quickly, I handed them over, hoping the records would somehow prove the government's case against the bankruptcy lawyers. Then, about a week later, I got notice from the Internal Revenue Service. Karen and I had been selected for an audit. An audit? Now? When I contacted the IRS, I told a bored civil servant that the FBI had all my records. She sounded skeptical, but said she'd check out my claim, which of course turned out to be true. Not long after that, I got a notice on FBI letterhead stating that I was exempt from tax audits for 7 years, beginning 3 years prior to the current year and stretching 3 years into the future. The FBI letter was a silver lining, a breather in what, for the past 2 years, had been a very bumpy and mostly negative ride. It seemed the feds also smoothed over the contempt charge because I never heard another word about that. And now, Karen and I needed a break. In the film Shawshank Redemption, actor Tim Robbins plays Andy Dufresne's, a man serving prison time under a cruel warden for a murder he didn't commit. After making a secret decision to execute his plan of escape, Andy asks his friend Red, played by Morgan Freeman, You know what the Mexicans say about the Pacific? No, Red says, as the two men sit against a wall in the prison yard. They say it has no memory. That's where I want to live the rest of my life. A warm place with no memory. Andy Dufresne's plan sounded perfect to me. In February 2007, the month after the bankruptcy hearing, Karen and I, with Skelly and his wife, escaped to Mexico on that trip I told you about at the very beginning of this book. In case you forgot, here's a little rewind. We land and check into our resort. I immediately go out and find the Greek to get free cocaine. On the fifth day, I'm about to run out of coke. In the middle of the night, I walk to that lonely place where the drug dealer Clean Cut calls in some coke to be delivered from the next town. Things go sideways, and his enforcer, Eyes, lays his machete against my neck. Remember him asking me for a cigarette and me reaching into my t shirt pocket to pull out my last one? Remember that little packet of cocaine slipping up from the cellophane pack wrapper and into full view? I will never forget it. My blood absolutely ran cold. Clean Cut had already suspected I was the gringo who was somehow connected with the rival drug dealers. If he saw that I was here in the middle of the night trying to buy cocaine when I already had cocaine, he would decide I had set him up and his enforcer would kill me on the spot. 100%. Nothing I had faced in my life, not jumping out of a moving bus, not faulty parachutes or motorcycle wrecks or bookie leg breakers, had ever filled me with such terror. This was the difference between thinking you're going to die and knowing you're going to die. When that teener came up out of my pocket, all those thoughts blinked through my mind in less than a second. My right hand was still at my shirt pocket, pulling out Clean Cut's cigarette. Had he seen the teener of coke? I had never practiced magic tricks, but now I employed sleight of hand, using my right hand to slip the cigarette from the pack, crumpled the cellophane wrapper around the teener, and tuck it back down into my pocket. Still terrified, I handed Clean Cut the cigarette and offered him a light again with the same hand. My nerve endings screamed as I watched his eyes for any flicker of danger. Gracias, he said with a small smile. There was a deep drag and a slow exhale. Ah, here it comes. He pointed toward a single headlight approaching from down the street. A young guy on a scooter slowed down just enough to toss Clean Cut a small package, then turned the throttle and disappeared into the night. There you go, amigo, Clean Cut said, handing me $100 worth of coke. I told you he would be here. Now you can go back to your wife. Willing myself to stay calm, I took the packet. Thanks, I said as I walked away. I muttered a few more complaints about how shabbily they had treated a good customer such as myself. I hadn't even gone half a block when I found a picnic table on the sidewalk outside of a deserted bar, laid out a line of coke, and inhaled it like oxygen. The next day, Skelly and I chartered a fishing boat. We had the whole boat to ourselves, a 35-footer, the same one we'd hired a couple of times before. It was the kind where you were supposed to catch big trophy fish like Dorado sailfish and marlin, but in previous years we had caught almost nothing. Being from Minnesota, where the fishing is great, and being a guy with almost zero patience, I found this unacceptable. The last time we came down, in 2006, I said to the captain, a middle aged Mexican man, "Hey, we're tired of paying $450 to go out on these excursions and never catching anything. Tell you what, let's go double or nothing. If we catch a fish over 100 pounds, we'll pay you double. But if we catch nothing, we pay nothing. Deal?" The captain sized me up from under the bill of his ball cap and grinned. "Si, senor, you have a deal." He motored away from the pier and into a 6-foot swell that pitched the deck up and down like a carnival ride. Skelly and I both got seasick. Hours passed without a bite, and both of us were so green at the gills we were ready to puke. But the captain didn't care. He just stood at the wheel smiling. I remember looking at Skelly and saying, "He's going to keep us out here until we catch a $900 fish." Finally, we broke down and told him we'd pay him $450 just to take us to shore. He smiled again. "Si, senor, you have a deal." He came about and we were headed in when Skelly's line jerked. After a brief battle, He hauled in 120-pound sailfish, and not long later, I landed a sailfish north of 100 pounds too. We forgot all about our seasickness, paid the captain his $900, and everybody went home happy. On this trip, though, I was not happy. We sat in the stern of the same boat miles offshore, the deck rocking gently as we watched our lines. Sunlight sparkled off the calm, blue waters of the Pacific. Suddenly, I just started talking. I had already told Skelly a lot of my problems, but I had never told anyone how bad things really were. Now I had to tell someone, but not Karen, because I didn't want her to panic. Instead, I laid it all out in living color for my best friend. I wasn't asking Skelly for money. For one thing, I didn't think any ordinary amount of money would help. I'd gotten us in so deep that only an amount in the hundreds of thousands would have made a difference. And the money I was wasting on drugs and on this vacation, to me, that was like saying that breathing was wasting effort on air. Karen and I needed this break, I rationalized. We never missed our vacations. The fishing boat rocked and a gentle swell slapped against the hull as I spilled my guts. I told Skelly everything. My house was approaching foreclosure. Two guys had taken control of my corporate board. They had fired Karen and me from our own company. Wayne Bellisle owned my patent, and I owed him $84,000. I was in debt to the tune of more than $200,000. As I ticked off all my problems, I watched Skelly's expression grow more and more grim. I finished my story and said, "If you were me, what would you do?" My best friend looked at me. I could see that a large tear had formed in the corner of his right eye. He turned his gaze to the rail that ran along the edge of the boat and to the deep ocean beyond. "I'd jump," he said. Digital Hook, hold, are you watching? Chapter 26. Psyching out the suits. I'll tell you the truth. When Skelly said I'd jump, it rattled me. He wasn't the type of guy who got overly emotional. That my best friend would say that to me and mean it really took me by surprise. More surprises waited back home. One Thursday in March 2007, soon after we returned from Mexico, I was sitting on my deck in Carver when Jack Colby and Shelby Bates showed up. It was about 9 a.m. We hadn't much contact. We hadn't had much contact since they had fired Karen and me in December. I had been brainstorming ways to take back control of my company. Colby and Bates had tried to get control of the My Pillow website, but I had set up the hosting account under a friend's name, and she wouldn't give them access. That morning, the duo knocked on my front door, shocked that they had the gall to show up at my house, but also curious about what they wanted. I let them in and offered them beers. When they declined, I opened one for myself, and we all took a seat out on the deck. "Hey, Mike, we know you're under a deadline to make enough pillows for the next show," Bates said. His voice was strangely loud. "Can we get into the factory and help make some?" The factory he referred to was the old bus shed across the street, where I kept the new hammer mill that produced my foam fill, which was still patent pending. My sewing machines were in there too, along with the foam and the custom printed fabric we used to make the pillow ticks. This was the first time Colby and Bates had expressed any interest in the manufacturing side of the business. I looked at their clothes. These guys had not come dressed to work. I took a sip of my beer. "No, sorry, you're not getting in there." I had already been down this road before with Barry Price. There was no way I was letting them in there. I didn't know what they were planning, but it certainly wasn't to help make pillows. Now Colby spoke up. "So, you're saying you're not letting us in your factory? Is that right?" He too was speaking very loudly and in a weird, unnatural rhythm. It was so weird that I mocked Colby, echoing his volume. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Why are you talking so loud? Both men kept pressing me with raised voices. It was like they had walked into an old folks' home and were trying to speak to the hard of hearing. Finally, Colby took a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to me with a smirk. I've got a court order requiring you to surrender your manufacturing equipment, he said. As I told you in December, my pillow has relocated to Inver Grove Heights, and we are moving the factory there. I waved the court order away. By then, I didn't care what they had on a piece of paper. Then, abruptly, Colby and Bates stood up and left. Even though I'd kept them out of the bus shed and away from my machine, their faces said they'd won the round. What was going on? I called a lawyer friend, Javier, and told him about the confrontation. What would it take for these guys to force me to give them my equipment? I asked. They would have to have in writing or on tape that you denied them access, Javier said. That explained the bizarre meeting. Colby and Bates had been taping me. Now their ham bone acting job made sense. Javier, you have to do me a favor, I said into the phone. Find out if a judge has ordered law enforcement to let them into the factory and find out when they're coming. I can't tell you that, Mike. I might be disbarred. I begged a little and we hung up. 15 minutes later, Javier called back. Let's have lunch at 11:30. Okay, see you then, I said and hung up again. I didn't need to know where we were having lunch. We had never had lunch in our lives. Colby and Bates were coming to seize my machine at 11:30 a.m. That was just over 2 hours away. I might not have had much money or clout, but I still had a lot of really great friends. I called up a bunch of them and told them what was going on. Meet me at the bus shed as quick as you can, I said. 4 or 5 guys rushed over, all of them driving pickups. We loaded up the foam and fabric and all the equipment, and my friends distributed it to barns and other locations across Carver County, places where Colby and Bates would not know to look. Next, I cleaned and swept the factory space until it was spotless. There was not a fleck of foam or fabric scrap left anywhere. The big place looked spanking clean, as if it were ready for a new tenant. I locked the building and left, grinning so wide my face hurt. Dick Lenzen, the bus shed landlord, told me what happened next. At 11:30, Colby and Bates showed up with a truck. Dick used his key to let them in. When Colby and Bates saw the empty, gleaming space, their mouths dropped open. Where is everything? Bates wanted to know. It was here last night, Dick said, genuinely surprised. I was here talking to Mike. He was telling the truth. I hadn't told Dick what I was doing because I didn't want him mixed up in any legal trouble. At home across the street, I waited for a knock on the door. Very quickly, Colby and Bates appeared on my stoop. They had reinforcements, 2 Carver County police officers who stood back a little on the lawn. These men, who had fired me now, pulled out another court order and shoved it my way. This one said, they said, gave them the right to seize my equipment and documents. I could see that the new order did not list specifics, which equipment and documents. Which equipment and documents? I said. I don't know what you're talking about. Furious, Colby jabbed his finger at the court paper. You also have to surrender your corporate books, he said. But I have a piece of paper for them, too. But I had a piece of paper for them, too. It was the letter I'd received saying that my financial records were in the custody of the FBI. One of the police officers stepped up and read it. We don't want anything to do with this, he said, handing the letter back to me. He turned to leave and told Colby and Bates to do the same. I tucked the FBI letter into my back pocket, then stood in my doorway, smiling and waving goodbye. That day I had the last laugh, but Colby and Bates weren't finished. In March 2007, I learned that they had struck a deal with Wayne Belle to buy my patent. I still owed Wayne $84,000 and had put his name on the patent as collateral. Now he wanted his money back. I went to see him. "You're not going to sell them this patent, are you?" I said. "Yep, we made a deal. They have until May 5th to come up with the money," Wayne said. I was upset, but I didn't blame him. It had been a year and a half since Wayne loaned me the money for the patent application. I could tell he felt bad about selling the patent out from under me, but $84,000 is a lot of money, and Wayne Belial was not a bank. "Maybe they'll make a mistake and miss the deadline," Wayne offered. "If they miss the deadline, will you sell it to me?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "If they miss the deadline and you come up with the money, I'll sell the patent back to you." It was a sliver of hope, but the odds of them not only missing the deadline, but me coming up with 84 grand were slim to none, and Slim had already left the building. Chapter 27, Countdown. That spring, I noticed something odd going on with Karen. We had a mutual friend, Steve, who had been as much a friend to one half of our couple as the other. But lately it seemed the friendship scale was getting out of balance. When the three of us were together, it seemed to be two against one, as if Steve and Karen had some private pact. I figured he had been whispering in Karen's ear, along with all those other friends who wondered why she put up with the chaos. By now, some were telling her straight out to leave me. But Steve worried me in a different way. He was one of those guys who considered himself a ladies' man, and the ladies he liked the most were married. I was suspicious of him, not my wife. Even when he took her side right in front of me, I thought to myself, "Steve, the last thing you're gonna, the last thing you're getting is Karen." I had so many other things to worry about: the bankruptcy judgment, the money I owed Ed, and most of all, the patent fight. There was one bright spot. My brother Corey, the cautious engineer, had saved up money for retirement. I pleaded with him to put up the money to buy Wayne out. "You've got to believe me, Corey. When my pillow catches on, it's going to be big." I really needed Corey to trust me in spite of my track record, and he did when no one else would. He agreed to tap into his retirement to write Wayne Belial a check for $84,000. That was great news, but if Colby and Bates came up with the money before the May 5th deadline, it wouldn't matter. My pillow, like many other products invented by penniless entrepreneurs, would be snapped up by people who had more money than passion for innovation. Karen and I had converted one of our bedrooms into an office, and I spent days and nights in there playing through, smoking crack, and trying to figure out how to dig out of the mess I'd created. At the age of 46, I couldn't even imagine my financial situation going back to square one. But we were actually back to far worse, counting our house and the bankruptcy judgment, which was now underwater due to our subprime refinance. We were over $500,000 in debt. I had poured the mortgage loan money into manufacturing, but also into drugs and gambling. Now we were behind on the mortgage again, and I had begun to receive foreclosure threats in the mail, as well as red lettered notices from the electric company threatening to shut off our power. Every waking moment I obsessed over all this, but my biggest fixation was the patent. All I wanted was a reset button, a way to turn back time. All Colby and Bates had to do was pay for the patent, and everything we'd worked for would be gone at the stroke of a pen. One day in early April, I was sitting in our bedroom office running the numbers like Rain Man, high on crack and in a dark, hopeless mood. Karen and Darren were out in the living room packing pillows and boxes to fulfill internet orders from the stock We had left. To them, it was just another day in our family business. They were handing they were hand addressing the boxes with Sharpies when Karen got frustrated with the process. She poked her head into the office and told me so. It was time consuming, she complained. And besides, it made our product look cheap. I think we should get one of those automatic label maker things, she said. Her statement was the tiniest thing, perfectly reasonable. But I couldn't bottle up my fear any longer, and I exploded in anger. Don't you get it? It doesn't matter how the boxes are labeled. It's too late. We're losing everything. They're taking it all. Karen winced as if someone had snuck up and hit her from behind, and in a way I had. She knew about the patent fight, but I had told her we would win. She knew about the bankruptcy judgment, but I had told her the FBI was going to get us out of that. And uh, she had no idea we were behind again on the mortgage. I hadn't told her about that at all, but now I laid it into her as if it were her fault. She didn't have all the facts. An automatic labeler, I said, mocking her. Why are you bothering me with something so trivial? Don't you understand? It doesn't matter. My fear for our future was all over my face, and it was the first time I'd let Karen see it. I couldn't hide how serious things really were, no matter how many times I'd backed us into a corner. Karen had always put her faith in me, though it sometimes wasn't pretty. I'd always found a way out, but now I'd played all my cards. We were no longer in control of our own destiny. Chapter 28. Lights Out. April 29th was Karen's 50th birthday, and I paid to throw a big party for her at the American Legion Hall in Chaska. A lack of money had never stopped me before, and, true to form, I somehow scraped together enough to make it happen. I was still spending a lot of time locked in my office, and I hadn't slept in days. But with the help of friends and family, we decorated the party venue and put out a home cooked spread of burgers, ribs, and barbecue beef with all the trimmings. I bought a big cake, and relatives drove in from all over the place to honor Karen. Our Coke/crack friends came too, taking advantage of the open bar and sneaking off to the bathrooms more often than everyone else. To all but a few of our friends, Karen and I looked as normal and happy as we ever had. But in the days leading up to the party, I had been noticing in her a strange defiance. I can't remember why the three of us were in the car together, but Karen, Steve, and I were running around Carver a couple of days before the party. I had gotten a fresh supply of cocaine, and Karen was holding on to it. Then, when I asked her for the coke, she wouldn't give it to me. She had never done that before. We got into a mild argument, and Steve sided with Karen. Their united front was even more obvious than before, like they were a team, and I remembered thinking, where do I fit in here? But I did not suspect her of cheating with Steve. In fact, I had become so obsessed with the patent problem and so intent on staying high to block the pain of our coming financial collapse that I was blind to everything else. After the party on the 29th, a bunch of us wound up at Steve's house, a fancy rental that was considered a historical landmark in Chanhassen. It was a Sunday night, and we partied into the early morning hours, but our finances and the patent never left my mind for long. In fact, I spent much of the night listing all the frightening details for a friend of ours, Mary Lee. As the crowd thinned out, Karen spent the evening talking to Steve. Monday morning came and reality set in. The kids would be waiting for us. Karen's birthday was over, and it was time to go home. As the few stragglers still at Steve's headed for the door, I said to Karen, "We have to go." She gave me that defiant look again. "I'm not leaving." That stopped me. I didn't know quite what to say to persuade her. I mentioned that she had the company cell phone. "Your phone is coming with me," I said, trying to get her to leave with me. Karen just looked at me and handed over the phone. I stood there for a minute feeling powerless. I certainly couldn't force her to leave. An eerie feeling crept over me, a sense of impending doom. Unable to process what was happening, I walked out of Steve's house and drove home alone. By this time, I hadn't slept in several days. Maybe that's why, when I walked in my own front door, I saw things with a new set of eyes. My house was in shambles, not just because the kids had spent much of the weekend there alone. It was much more than that. Our belongings were strewn everywhere. I saw piles of laundry and stacks of dishes caked in dried food. The house obviously hadn't been cleaned for a while. Karen had always been meticulous about these kinds of things. It was as if an invisible hand ripped a blindfold off my eyes. In a flash, I realized that my house had been falling apart around me for a long time. How had I missed it? What else was I not seeing that was right in front of my face? That feeling of dread swept over me again. I yelled at Lizzie, who was now 19. "You have to help me clean up this house. Something terrible is going to happen." "What are you talking about?" she said. "I don't know. Something's going on with your mother." "Well," she said, "we are a very dysfunctional family." Blood rushed to my head, and I felt a pulse in my neck. "What? I don't even know what that means. But don't you ever say it again." "I'm leaving," Lizzie said, and she did. Karen hadn't come home with me, and now Lizzie was leaving too. I ran downstairs to get Charlie. He would help me clean up the mess. But when I reached his room, I saw that it was 2 feet deep in trash. Also, I noticed flood damage. Our basement had flooded some time before, and I had not repaired the mess. Charlie's bedroom door was warped, the ceiling sagged, and the closet doors wouldn't close. I suddenly realized that I'd let my son live in his room like that. I was angry with myself, and I took it out on him. "You are 18 years old, and you're living like a pig!" I yelled. I glanced around wildly and noticed items we'd been missing in the household for months. "You are going to get trash bags and sort this mess out." I don't remember what else I yelled, but Charlie started yelling too. He began picking up items from the pile on the floor and throwing them into random piles. When he threw a baseball trophy I felt should be treasured, I flipped out. "Don't you dare throw that!" I yelled. "That means something to our family." Darren came running down the stairs. "Leave Charlie alone," he shouted. I yelled at Darren to stay out of it and kept shouting at Charlie to clean this place up. I was now completely unglued. Something terrible is going to happen, I kept repeating out loud. My world was collapsing. My marriage, my family, my house, my business. Deep inside, some twisted logic drove me. If I could just get the house cleaned up, those other things would fall into place too. I could hit the reset button. I could hold off disaster. Charlie wouldn't cooperate with this fantasy, however, and Darren was still screaming in his brother's defense. I noticed a huge ceramic pot pipe in the shape of a dragon. I grabbed it, smashed it on the floor, and started railing on Charlie for smoking pot. What? He screamed, bursting into tears. Who are you to talk? That's when I kicked him out of the house. After the meltdown with my boys, I shut everything and everyone out. I locked myself in the office and returned to my crack pipe, as well as the countdown that had plagued me since March. I told myself that the patent was everything. Charlie would be fine. Darren would get over it. Karen would come home, and so would Lizzie. If I could save the patent, I could save everything, and they would all forgive me. It was April 30. Colby and Bates had 5 days left to make their move for patent ownership. I knew that one of them, I couldn't remember which, was overseas. It was my understanding that he wouldn't return until the second week in May. I could only pray other that the other one would wait until his partner got back to pay Wayne. I had reason to hope. The two had approached a previous transaction involving the patent with huge hesitation because they were having trouble getting the rest of the company from me. Also, I had sent them crazy emails hoping to scare them off. Reading them, they told Wayne they thought I was certifiable. If you think he's certifiable, why would you try to make why would you try to take his dream? If you think he's certifiable, why would you try to take his dream? Wayne had said. My behavior was by design. I hoped that Colby and Bates would underestimate me. I hoped they would see me as an unemployed, bankrupt addict without the financial means to challenge them. If they thought I was also literally nuts, maybe they would be as lackadaisical about this deadline as they had the first one. If they missed it, Corey and I could swoop in and buy the patent back from Wayne. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I had now been up for 5 days and was still locked in the office when Karen finally came home. It was about 10 p.m., and I was relieved when I heard her walk in the door. The feeling didn't last long. Charlie had been waiting outside and told his mother everything. Karen went ballistic. When she banged on the office door, I threw it open. We had an epic fight, screaming and yelling until I finally said I didn't care. Charlie could stay. Then I retreated into the office and locked the door again. I smoked more crack and fantasized about Corey writing a check to Wayne Belial. Around midnight, Kevin Chase came over and sat with me in my office. I told him how bad things were. Hours passed. I swung between hope and despair. Kevin and I had been shut in the office for a very long time. When I looked at the clock, it was now well toward dawn. I was a little surprised that Karen hadn't come in to say hello to Kevin. We'd had blowout fights before, and one or the other of us usually came forward to make peace. It was her turn to make the first move. I felt since she was the only one who had stayed at Steve's, it was her turn to make the first move, I felt, since she was the one who had stayed at Steve's, but she didn't. I went downstairs and found Charlie. We greeted each other stiffly. Where's your mother? I asked. Charlie looked at me sadly, accusingly. She left. What do you mean she left? I mean, she packed a bag and left. With who? Steve? I said. Yes, Charlie said. She's gone. An hour later, the lights went out. can't show you the pictures. You gotta buy the book. Oh, cool. I will show you him working on his pillow. Just that fish he caught. That's a big fish. This is his patent number. That's why I love reading this book, because you learned about him in real life first. And then when you read the book, you know it's not just some story. This has been a reading of What Are the Odds by Mike Lindell, from Crack Addict to CEO. Digital Hall Codes and owns no copyrights to the reading of this material for educational purposes only. Chapter 29, to be continued.